Up until the 1970s, American and Western horror had been almost exclusively white. In 1968, Night of the Living Dead became a landmark movie for having a black man in the lead role. Until this point, black people had been relegated to supporting roles or would be othered in some way or another. But in 1972, American International Pictures, who specialised in low-budget exploitation cinema, produced a film directed by a black filmmaker, William Crane, and starring a prestigious black stage actor, William Marshall. The film was Blacula. Blacula took many of the classic vampire and Dracula tropes, but rooted it in modern black culture. Blacula became known as the first black horror film. It was a huge hit and helped launch a movement that became known throughout the 1970s as Blaxploitation. While often Blaxploitation movies were cheap productions made to be churned out quickly to maximize profit, some gave black directors the chance to make artistic, thought-provoking art films that could be distributed to wider audiences. By the Christians, it is written that in the black age. In 1973, Bill Gunn made his vampire film, Ganja and Hess, which felt less like a traditional horror film and instead more like an experimental and intensely personal reflection on race, class, and gender. Unlike Blacula, Ganja and Hess didn't impress American audiences of the time. It was almost too bold, too ahead of its time, and too black for white audiences. But nowadays, Ganja and Hess is considered one of the great vampire films of the 1970s and a seminal text in the history of black horror cinema. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of the vampire and we discuss Blacula and Ganja and Hess. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres one series at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 8th series exploring the evolution of the vampire movie, and this is part 12. This week's episode is sponsored by $20 Patreon subscriber Martin Aldridge, and in this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we are going to be looking at two Blaxploitation vampire classics from the 70s. That's Blacula from 1972 and Ganja and Hess from 1973. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. They are fascinating films, so I would urge everyone to give both movies a watch before listening to our discussions. So joining me for this week's episode, I've got a brand new guest. Very excited to have her here. She is an award-winning author. She's a screenwriter. She's also a film historian and educator, and she was the executive producer of one of my favourite documentaries of the last decade, Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. It is my great pleasure to welcome to the podcast Tananarive Due. Hello, Tananarive.
Hey, great. You said my name perfectly.
Oh, did I? Oh, thank God. Thank you so much for joining me. I don't know what it's like over where you are right now, but England is the hottest it's ever been.
I've heard a bit about your heat. I live in Southern California, and I feel sorry for you. So that's where this is going. And I actually want to give a shout out to the University of Leeds, because I got my master's degree there.
Oh, yeah.
And it's really hard for me to imagine England having a heat wave from my experience there. I'll tell you that right now.
As you can imagine, we are not coping well. No, we are not prepared for this kind of heat.
What's that glowing ball in the sky? And why is it so uncomfortable? Is what I think is probably what's happening over there right now.
Exactly. Oh, but anyway, let's talk about horror, Tananarive. Tell me, what I always love to ask all of my new guests is, what is your horror origin story? When did you first fall in love with horror?
Well, I have to lay that at the feet of my late mother. Her name was Patricia Stevens Due, and she was a civil rights activist. At first glance, maybe not the kind of personality you would think would even be swept away by flights of fancy like watching horror movies. But I have come to realize I executive produced a documentary called Horror Noir, A History of Black Horror. And while we were doing that and listening to other people talk about their origin stories with horror, I came to understand that I think, especially for, let's say, African-American horror fans, a lot of us were brought into it by our parents, even our grandparents. And I think it was because horror is such a great way to process trauma, especially big trauma that you can't just fix. You can't just leave the house. You can't just get a divorce. Like big trauma, like systemic racism and intergenerational trauma. You need sometimes a monster to focus that on. And one example I'll give you is The Fly. That was like, she used to show me those old Universal horror movies. So I was watching The Fly, and The Mole People is a great one. And in both cases, in the case of The Fly, spoiler, and I mean the original Fly from the 50s, I'm not talking about the Jeff Goldblum one. That last moment, spoiler, if you haven't seen it, is a man who is like mostly a fly, but he has a human head. He's caught in a web, and he's right next to someone on a bench, but he's going, help me, and they can't hear.
Yeah.
That voicelessness, holy cow, still gets under my skin. And for The Mole People, which I rewatched as an adult and could not understand why it had such an impression on me as a kid. It was so boring for the first hour, and then just so campy and not interesting. But then I realized, oh, the Mole People were a slavery metaphor, and I really picked up on that. They were being whipped. They were rising up. That's what I loved about the Mole People. I wasn't afraid of them. I was rooting for them.
I love it. And you mentioned horror noir there. I mean, like, what a fantastic documentary. And I think for me and for so many horror fans out there, it's one of the best horror documentaries that I've seen in decades. And just tell me a little bit about how that came about and your involvement in it.
Well, I was just very, very lucky to be brought in. I was brought in after all the hard part was over, like the pitching. I hate pitching. So they already had it set up at Shudder by the time they came to me. And that was a no-brainer for me to be an executive producer and to give some commentary on air. But in terms of just general background, it was directed by Xavier Bergen, and Phil Nobile Jr. and Ashley Blackwell were really laying that groundwork. After Get Out, just a lot of us realized after Jordan Peele released Get Out that it was a game changer for Black horror creatives. And in so many ways, right? I started a whole course at UCLA called The Sunken Place, which was also a history of Black horror, which I still teach now 5 years later. And that was the spirit of that documentary, was understanding. I don't know for sure that they had started pitching it before Get Out. It's very possible. But we had reached this point where Get Out especially just illustrated that it was important to understand what had come before. And even if Jordan Peele wasn't personally familiar with every film in the documentary, which I somehow doubt he was, he is a part of a lineage of storytelling that uses horror as a way to express racial trauma, which was what Get Out was. So if you're a Black viewer, you're like, oh my God, this is exactly what it feels like when I'm the only one in the room, the only one in the classroom, the only one in the boardroom, and if you're a white viewer, you're like, oh my God, am I being like that person at the party who's hyper aware that there's that one Black person in the room? And am I saying stupid things about Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods because that's all I can think of right now? So we're all, and it was so powerful so they pitched it, and it was the day Get Out won the Oscar that they got the green light from Shudder, which again just shows you the impact it started. And that's not the end of it by any means. The impact is just far reaching and continuing all these years later in terms of getting projects set up, getting meetings for all kinds of marginalized creators, not just Black creators. It was a real game changer. But Black horror in particular, while it's not always about race, and if you watch horror noir, you can see that, but a lot of filmmakers do take that opportunity. I have this platform, and I want to say something about history. I want to say something about the isolation of the Black experience, or whatever it is. So that's sort of where horror noir came from. That's the long answer to your question.
I love it. Well, it's absolutely fantastic. And I think for me and for so many horror fans, particularly probably white horror fans, it opened my eyes to a load of movies that I had not heard of or had the chance to watch at that point as well. And I think it gave me such an incredible list of movies to then immediately go and check out as well. So it's
great.
Really valuable. Yeah,
that is great. And you've picked a couple of good ones to talk about today, because
so exciting. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So let me ask you a little bit about this. We're gonna go chronologically, and I want to ask you first of all about Blacula.
Yes.
But I guess first of all, just as a bit of a backdrop, where was horror? Where was specifically, I suppose, black horror and black representation in horror before Blacula in 1971?
It had a long way to go.
Yeah.
It had a very long way to go. I mean, there were some strides in the 1960s, a major one being Night of the Living Dead with Dwayne Jones cast in the lead. That was very much constantly described as accidental casting. I don't want to believe it, but I have no choice but to believe it. So many people say that it was just accidental casting because Dwayne Jones was the best audition. But when you look at Night of the Living Dead through a lens of race, which is hard not to do when you have a black man cast in the lead, which, by the way, in the 1960s was very rare. Okay. Especially like a movie that wasn't showcasing one of the few talents who had managed to emerge, your Sidney Poitiers or, these kinds of people. So this is an unknown guy who gets cast in this movie, and it's about society breaking down. And it just is layered with so much social commentary that it works like a dream. Colorblind casting, as it's called, doesn't always work, because a film that doesn't already have that foundation of social commentary can just introduce problems when you change the race, sort of not paying attention to social customs or problems of the era. But Romero was all about that. He was all about looking at what were our social problems of the era. And it was a very, very nice fit. And prior to that, the 1950s were pretty bland in terms of blackness and horror. Can't even really think of that many examples. As we pointed out in the documentary, it was all about sort of aliens and space monsters, and they couldn't think of even menial roles for Black characters. Whereas in the 40s and the 30s, unfortunately or fortunately, you could always be kind of a servant or comic relief, like a ballet. King of the Zombies is a good example, with Mantan Moreland playing sort of a valet, even though he was really the star of the movie. He was the biggest name, but he's comic relief, and that was where we were. We were kind of all these tropes of comic relief, or the monster, or like in a movie like The Mole People, there are no Black people, but the mole monsters represent otherness. And you're supposed to be making this really woke statement about the mistreatment of the other when you don't have any representation at all in the movie for people who are not white. So really, by the time we get to the 70s, and with the Blaxploitation era, which was a very unique period of time, because enough producers were progressive and proactive enough to want to show the representation. At the same time, they could create a business model where you didn't have to show your movie in theaters that didn't have Black people. You had these independent theaters in the inner city and in Black neighborhoods, and you could make your money basically showing movies to Black audiences. And that probably hasn't been true since, So this was a very interesting period. I may be speaking out of turn there. I don't know what it was like in the 80s, but I know we disappeared again in the 80s and a lot of horror, unless it was in some of these sort of tragically tropey roles like Sacrificial Negroes and Spiritual Guides and this kind of thing. But the 70s were a very interesting period. Not perfect. No. There's a reason it's Black and exploitation. Lots of bad stereotypes in some of these films. But I think in the case of Blacula in particular, this very young director, William Crane, I think he was only 23. How did he even get that gig? I want to hear that story.
Yeah.
But he took something that could have been purely formulaic, which I'm sure his bosses would have been happy with, but wanted to do something better and deeper with it. So that gives us Blacula.
You shall pay, Black Prince. I curse you with my name. You shall be Blacula.
Blacula, the Black Avenger, rising from his tomb to fill the night with horror. Blacula, Dracula's soul brother, deadlier even than he.
So, Blacula from 1972. Tananarive, tell us, set the scene for us, give us a little bit of the plot and setup of Blacula.
Well, sure. There's William Marshall, who is a very well-trained actor, plays, and that's another thing, casting, so important. William Marshall just brought a lot of gravitas to the role. So he plays a character named Prince Mamuwalde, and you can tell from that already that now we're in the 70s, the era of kind of Black is beautiful, wearing your hair in afros, trying to reach back through history to origins. So yeah, it makes sense. You would want to use an African character, a prince. It opens with the prince having a meeting with his wife and the Count Dracula trying to put an end to the slave trade. And the Dracula makes a almost casual comment about how he would pay for his wife. You know, it's a compliment of one of my station to look with desire on one of your color. So he's already, like, in the first 5 minutes, he's embedding it with racism and the history of slavery. And even probably most importantly, what I said in Horror Noir is that if you're a Black viewer in the 1970s, you have literally never seen an image of a Black prince in the 1700s holding court. Never. It's I'm just telling you, I don't think it had ever been done. So it's coming out of the box with something we might look at more casually today, but which represented a huge leap in representation in the 1970s. And he ends up getting imprisoned by Count Dracula, turned, sealed up in a coffin, his wife kidnapped and ultimately died. But then he's unearthed. He's unearthed in the present day, which is the 1970s, by a queer couple, actually. And some of that queer representation is a little unfortunate. I think it was meant to be inclusive. Yeah. But they're also first to die, right? So in some ways. Yeah. So it's a mixed bag in terms of, and also some homophobic language that all the characters use, which I don't know if that was meant to be a statement about homophobia or was actually bleeding a little bit of homophobia. Sometimes it's hard to tell. But basically, he goes on this rampage, meets a woman he thinks is his long lost dead wife. She looks just like her and is seeking love. But of course, as all tragic monsters do, when they're just doing their thing, sucking people's blood and killing people, everyone tries to chase them and kill them. And that's basically the story of Blacula. Other than the blackness, it's a very standard monster in the city story. Yeah. Who has to be contained, but at the same time, we feel empathy for him, as we often do with those universal monsters, for example, because he's lonely. We saw him get separated from his wife. We know he didn't ask for this life.
Yeah, you're so right about that. And it's something that's so important with vampires too, I think, isn't it? Like, what do you think of that William Marshall performance and the way he has to balance that kind of, I guess, the best sort of Dracula or vampire characters have to be kind of romantic and sexy, but also menacing and threatening at the same time, right? What do you think of this portrayal of that vampire character?
I think he did a great job. Now, I personally am not into vampires as erotic symbols. They just usually, but if I were, he would probably be my number one. Maybe so. I also like Chris Sarandon in Fright Night. But in terms of just pure sex appeal, very, very attractive actor. And because he's such a good actor and so smooth, he just sort of glides through his scenes. And you can see why he would be sort of catnip to the ladies, et cetera. Even wearing that ridiculous cape, he somehow worked it. He somehow made the cape work, and it was the 70s. Fashion was a bit questionable in the 70s. So that helps.
He's great. He makes that cape work. I love it. I think it's an incredible performance. What a fun film. This was the first time I'd ever really watched Blacula in preparation for this. I've seen it twice now. I really like it, especially having rewatched all of the kind of Dracula adaptations and the sort of more traditional vampire movies up until this point. I think they do an amazing job of kind of sticking to traditions in some regard and kind of retelling the story of Dracula, but also updating it and making it about, like you said, references to black history, to slavery, kind of weaving that in, and then also telling a story that feels very much in the 1970s, right? It feels very modern for its time. So I think it's a great, fun movie. And you can see why so many audiences, black and white audiences, loved it at the time, right? It feels like a real crowd pleaser in that regard. But what do you think of it, Tananarive, generally? Just like, are you, as a horror fan, do you enjoy watching Blacula?
I do. I teach it. And I don't know that I had seen it before, or at least not since childhood, before horror noir. So I went back to it as an adult, and it was only as an adult I was more into sort of the symbolism of using a prince, an African prince, and Swahili and all this kind of stuff. But it's fun. It's innovative. It has a great tracking shot that he had to fight for. It's scary, which is all I can ask from a horror movie.
Yeah.
And it's got this sort of anti-establishment feel, which I appreciate more and more as I get older, watching him throw police officers around and across the room. I just find that comforting in an era when more and more, especially in the United States, we feel there's a very complicated relationship with policing. So his demonstration of, and I know there was in the 70s too, it's not new. So his images, the images of Blacula sort of having his way with the police and being so powerful as opposed to the police is also very satisfying.
It's great, isn't it? All of that really holds up as well. You know, the casting of it, the way that, you know, so many of the main characters are black, obviously, and people in positions of power or people with these kind of high esteemed jobs, you know, whether it's the doctor or the mortician or whatever. These are all played by black actors. The only white actors of note are playing cops, right? And that kind of feels very deliberate. So I love the way that all of that stuff is kind of weaved into this story as well.
So it wasn't my lack of pull at headquarters. Strange how so many sloppy police jobs involve black victims.
You're getting paranoid. Schaefer wasn't black. We'll find them all. Send Barnes over there right away.
What an amazing job William Crane did. And William Crane, I can't believe how young he was. Like you said, he was 23, right? When he
very young. I mean, in his 20s. His 20s.
Yeah. And what do you think? I mean, like that must have been hard for him, right, at the time, because am I right in thinking as well, you know, obviously we've got a black director and black cast, but most of the crew was white, I believe.
Absolutely.
Right?
That's still true, unfortunately, a great deal today.
Right.
That when you see these shows, especially an ensemble show, and there's one black actor, you can imagine that actor is almost in pure isolation. There's no one black behind the camera. There's no one else black in the cast. It's not happening as often, but yes, it was an all-white crew. This young director who's having to fight for his decisions. And he somehow did it. To me, it's just a miracle when people can work their way up through the system and get that kind of a platform. So I'm serious when I want to know, how did you do that, dude? How did you even get in place to have that kind of impact? But he got the chance, he used it. And I think I know, because the movie was profitable and there were people trying to imitate it, as we'll discuss in a while later, that it must have made money.
Yeah.
So it was successful in terms of what they were looking for on the commercial end, it sounds like. But also he was walking that dance of being able to insert some things that were meaningful to him as a director.
And it also looks beautiful, doesn't it? I mean, I know that he had to fight, right, to get certain sort of cameras and certain shots he wanted. You know, there's that really kind of memorable, iconic shot of the slow motion of the vampire woman running down the corridor towards the camera and everything. I mean, it still looks beautiful, doesn't it?
It looks great. It looks absolutely great. And that's a shot that now, you know, since the 70s we're very familiar with, but before that time that was something that would have been pretty shocking.
So I mean, you've mentioned this already, but I wanted to ask you again about that opening scene. I mean, just how important is that opening scene, you know, where we've got the prince sort of negotiating with Dracula about you know, abolishing slavery and everything, right? And again, it's like this must have been something entirely kind of new and unusual for especially a kind of genre film at this time, I imagine.
Well, it works like a charm just in terms of pure storytelling.
Yeah.
Because, okay, I'm sure his directive was black vampire, it's pretty vague, but make a black vampire movie. So it's like, okay, well, how does he become a vampire? I mean, he could have gone a lot of different ways, but I think it's really brilliant to go to the root source with Count Dracula himself, sort of as that baton, from mainstream horror to now black horror. It's like we recognize Dracula. This is a figure that everybody knows, and have him behave in this treacherous way, which he would have as a person during that time.
To totally cease the slave trade? I find that unrealistic. Slavery has merit, I believe.
Merit? You find merit in barbarity?
Barbarous from the standpoint of the slave, perhaps. Intriguing and delightful from mine. I would willingly pay for so beautiful an addition to my household as your delicious wife.
Sir, are you ill?
Yeah, of course he's in favor of slavery. He's got money. He's about, of course he likes the idea that he can buy and sell human beings and would like to buy his wife. And he kind of scoffs at Prince Mamuwalde's objections to slavery. And that was a great way to give audiences this sort of fantasy conversation in history between an abolitionist and a slaver, but again, it works on the storytelling level. It's, of course, he's going to be turned by Count Dracula himself. It makes it big and epic, and sets the stage for the story to come.
And I love that the movie kind of, it feels like at this point already assumes that we sort of know the story of Dracula, right? And that we sort of know vampires, and it feels like it's having a bit of fun with that. Like when we go next to the, as you say, the queer couple, right? They are sort of buying all these antiques, and they're sort of, and they talk a little bit about Dracula, and they describe the legend of Dracula as the creme de la creme of camp.
True.
You are obviously not attuned to the antique market. No. You see, where we come from now, honey, the legend of Dracula, I mean, that's the absolute creme de la creme of camp. I mean, we're going to get a fortune for these things.
Count Dracula was no legend. He was terribly real.
Oh, I know. I've seen all of his movies. I'm a real fan.
So I think that's really interesting as well, the fact that they say, oh, I've seen all of his movies. So this is set in a world where Dracula movies and Dracula fiction exists, right? But also Dracula is real. So it's doing a kind of fun, playful meta thing in this movie, which I kind of like. But then also there is this element of camp too. Like, I think, like you said, I think this portrayal of these gay characters has not aged very well, right? It's pretty over the top. It's pretty stereotypical. And like you say, there are some slurs later on in the film when people talk about them as well. But there is this whole feeling that this movie is kind of playing with this kind of camp reputation, I suppose, that Dracula maybe has at this point in pop culture. I don't know.
Well, I'm sure it was a very different look. It's the 70s, like I said. So the 70s are all about that ostentatious fashion. The more colors, the better. The brighter and louder, the better. So it is contemporizing the vampire story in a way that I'm not enough of a horror connoisseur to say if there was something comparable, like from the late 60s that was more mainstream vampire. But we're talking about the 70s, and it is of its time, okay, in that way, with the added feature of Blackness. And what you see in a lot of these Blaxploitation films is self-contained Black communities and Black achievement, right? So you're not thinking about the fact that the head forensic investigator is also Black.
Yeah.
And he's a boss over people who, white people who are under him. He's a peer to the most powerful characters in the story, which is something, we can take for granted now. But trust me, in the 1970s, that is not something people were used to seeing, was it Black people with power, Black people enjoying their lives, just hanging out at the nightclub and dancing. That's something I joke about with my Black horror students at UCLA, is that so much of Black horror involves like a party scene.
It's,
when there's so many movies where they're either at a nightclub or there's like literally someone's throwing a party. Even that 1940 movie, Son of Ngagi, when I guess they couldn't afford the copyright to even play music, there's a scene where the people are humming to have a party. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But in any case, it feels fresh in the 1970s, not just because of race.
And it's just so much fun too, right? And like you said, there is that emphasis, it feels like, on counterculture and black culture too in this movie. Like, William Crane spends considerable time in the nightclub. Like, we just stop all the action in order to just appreciate the bands and the singers and the music in that nightclub, right?
Yes.
So to myself, I say, look the other way when it come by you. Look the other way when it come by you.
What do you think William Crane is sort of going for tonally through this film? Like you said, it does have its scary moments, but also it kind of feels like it's going for this kind of fun, you know, grab your friends and go to the movies late on a Friday night and just have fun with it kind of vibe, right? That's the kind of impression I get when you watch scenes like this scene in the nightclub.
I would say, especially leading into the camp, it's more of a fun night out. He delivers the scares. He delivers that unique camera angle and the woman running at you with their fangs. That's scary stuff. But he's also delivering fun, humor, because in that same nightclub scene, Blacula makes the comment about the Bloody Mary. You know, he orders a Bloody Mary and kind of an inside joke and all that kind of thing. So it's a blend of humor, community, which is something that you see very often in black horror, but also the scares.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the vampire? Are you a fan just generally of like the vampire subgenre? Are you a fan of kind of like, you know, Dracula and all its various incarnations and vampire movies we've had since this?
I mean, I'll watch them.
Yeah.
Not my favorite.
Yeah.
I've never even seen Twilight, actually. Don't tell anyone. Like I said, I did love Fright Night. Chris Sarandon, I thought, was a very, very sexy, scary vampire. But ultimately, I don't know, maybe there's just some disconnect between me and what's supposed to present as an erotic figure in some of these films. They're just not my thing. You know what I mean? They're not pushing my buttons in that way. I'm not afraid of them and I'm not attracted to them as much. I think what frightens me the most about the vampire subgenre is the idea of turning into something you don't want to be.
Yeah.
Right. More so than the vampire. It's like what happens after the vampire bites you, loss of self, loss of agency, addiction, that kind of thing is scarier to me than the actual vampire.
Agreed. And that's why when we get, I mean, that's something we can talk about with Ganja and Hess, definitely, right?
Absolutely.
But I think it really explores
yes.
some of those issues. And I think what is interesting about the vampire, and which is why it's great roles for people like William Crane, right, is that unlike a zombie that shuffles around and just wants to bite you, or a werewolf, you know, vampires are erudite and educated and suave and sophisticated, right? And they can be all of these things as well as being evil and scary and everything. So you can see why so many actors want to play these kind of Dracula type roles, I suppose. You know?
Right. I understand why people like vampires. It's just I'm way more into zombies and demons.
Yeah.
Yes.
I love that. But I think that's the other thing about vampires that a lot of my guests have talked about this series, because what I find really interesting is that a lot of people have had the same answer that you've had, Tananarive, about this subgenre, is that everyone who I ask, you know, what do you think of vampires? So many of them have said, it's not my favourite. And I think that's because vampires are the kind of populist monster, right? They are the more mainstream. They are the more sexy and less the outsiders, right? And compared to demons or zombies, for example. And maybe that's another reason why Blaxploitation really did jump on vampires initially, because, you know, that's a very popular subgenre. Maybe with a text like Dracula and a subgenre like the vampires, you know, Blaxploitation studios that are out to make a buck know that that's a good, easy text that is going to draw audiences in. It is the populist choice when it comes to horror, right? But I think another thing that's really interesting about that then is that since then it's sort of trickled away from the horror genre, and we get a lot more, you know, vampire comedies, vampire romance, and whatever else. And it is, you know, it's gone so far into the kind of populism sphere that almost doesn't belong in horror anymore, I suppose.
Yeah, like when you think of Interview with a Vampire with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, I mean, it's pretty to look at. It's stylish, but is it scary?
Yeah,
I don't think it is.
It's not.
I don't think it is scary now.
It's not. So tell me a little bit about, again, we brought up Blaxploitation. Is this what, how important was this movie in the kind of launch, I suppose, of Blaxploitation and black horror?
Well, it was one of the successes. It's one of the ones that has withstood the test of time, along with Shaft, which is probably the gold standard for the Blaxploitation era. Even people who haven't seen any other Blaxploitation movies often have seen Shaft or know the song, or So that, and there were a lot of movies we've forgotten. There are a lot of movies that and I haven't even really delved into the Blacula sequels, as much as I probably feel like I should have. But it feels to me like Blacula was a solid foundation and a hit in terms of what those producers were trying to do, which frankly, it was the bottom line. I mean, the artists themselves wanted to make statements and messages, but the producers were all about that profit. So
Yeah, it's really fascinating, this kind of like little subgenre within a subgenre that was really sparked, I think, by Blacula, right? The success of Blacula. So Blacula ended up grossing over $1 million, which made it one of the biggest grossing movies of 1972, and is generally thought of as the movie that really kicked off the wave of Blaxploitation. I think there had been kind of proto-Blaxploitation films that had come, in the years leading up to this. So obviously, like you said, Shaft the year before. Even in 1970s, movies like They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, which was a kind of slightly more Blaxploitation-y sort of sequel to In the Heat of the Night. And there were a few other movies like that had kind of, achieved moderate success. But I think Blacula really, it kind of solidified the mold, I suppose. And, the template for what a Blaxploitation film looked and sounded like. And we talk about this so often with horror, the way in which we get these cycles. You get one big success story, and then, of course, all of the studios decide to do something very similar. So you get these kind of different spins on classic horror texts, right? So movies like Abbey, which was a kind of Exorcist ripoff, right? Blackenstein, which came out in 1973, a year later, obviously a kind of Frankenstein take there. Movies like, of course, Foxy Brown, Sugar Hill, which kind of, talks about sort of voodoo magic, doesn't it? And that kind of thing. So, and Blacula itself had a sequel too, didn't it? Scream, Blacula Scream, starring Pam Grier as well. So they all kind of did the same thing, some more successful than others by the sounds of it, right? But all of these different movies that were starring black people and made by black people were getting greenlit and were getting lots of attention. So, I guess obviously we got lots of kind of pale imitators of Blacula, but then also some really incredible movies too, right? It seems as though I think Blacula was kind of directly responsible or indirectly responsible for Ganja and Hess, right?
Yeah, the producers behind Ganja and Hess literally just wanted to copy it. That was sort of the marching orders for William Gunn. Bill Gunn, the director of Ganja and Hess, was do a Blacula.
Well, there we go. Well, maybe we should talk about Ganja and Hess then.
Wasn't that a great transition? Look at that transition.
Such a good transition, wasn't it? Go us. Hello, everybody. Before we get into Ganja and Hess, just going to take a quick moment to thank this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber, Martin Aldridge. A huge thank you to Martin. I think he's been a long-time supporter of the podcast, and thank you so much, Martin, for becoming a $20 patron. Martin sent me a little message, so I'm going to read that out now. Martin says, "Hi, Mike. I'm a $20 patron because your show is worth the money. I don't have anything to plug personally. I've been here since the beginning. I searched for Kim Newman in Apple Podcasts in late 2017 and happened upon your first episode. Binged the next few, and you've been in charge of my monthly viewing schedules ever since. All the love." please devote an episode to my wonderful wife, Aglaire, with apologies from me. I'm not trying to palm this off on you for all of the horror movies that she sat through for my sake, especially the weird ones. Also, a shout out for her home country of Lithuania, which has one of the oldest and most beautiful languages in the world, and which underwent such tremendous hardship, and so bravely to achieve freedom in living memory. Thanks for everything and all the best. Loving the vampire season. Oh, thank you so much, Martin, and big love to you and to Aglaire. I'm so glad that you're enjoying the podcast and you're enjoying the vampire season, and thank you again for being such a supporter of the podcast since the very beginning. So one more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor. That's $20 Patreon subscriber Martin Aldridge. And don't forget, if you want to become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, get your own little message read out and your own dedicated segment on an episode just like this one, then you need to sign up to our Patreon at a $20 level. Just head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror.
Come and get me, motherfucker.
That was a little clip you just heard there from the new trailer for Halloween Ends. Here we go. Another new Halloween movie is upon us. It's obviously coming out mid-October. This was the first trailer for it, which dropped just last week on social media. And this is a little preview of what we've got coming up over on Patreon because, well, there are a couple of things to mention. Next week, it's the next episode of our Fresh Blood strand, which is the new monthly strand that I do with my three co-hosts, Becky, Brad, and Louise, in which we talk about everything new and fresh in the world of horror. So we review and recommend new movies, TV shows, games, but we also discuss horror news and discuss trailers and that kind of thing. So in next week's Fresh Blood episode, me and my three co-hosts will be breaking down and discussing the Halloween Ends trailer, and we will be making our predictions, what we hope / what we think might happen in the supposed final installment of the Halloween franchise, which is being released in a couple of months' time. Now, not only that, I don't know why I'm doing this, but I am. In a couple of months' time, over on Patreon for $10 donors, I am going to be doing a special mini-series that's going to be a Halloween retrospective. So, across maybe 6 or 7 weeks, I am going to be going through and discussing every single Halloween movie in the franchise. So I'll be joined by different guests each week. We're going to start with Halloween from 1978. We're going to talk about all of the crazy 80s sequels, Halloween's 2, 4, 5, 6. Obviously the weird and wonderful outlier, Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. We'll then go through to the postmodern era of the late 90s, early noughties to talk about Halloween H2O and Halloween Resurrection. We then move into the Rob Zombie era in the late noughties with Halloween and Halloween 2, and then finally we'll be revisiting the latest 2 movies in this new trilogy, Halloween 2018 and Halloween Kills, before finally deep diving into the, again, supposed final chapter of this franchise, Halloween Ends. So that is going to be every single week leading up to the release of Halloween Ends. So that mini season is going to kick off early September and run through to mid-October for $10 patrons. I'm kind of excited about it, I'm not going to lie. I know some of those films are going to be bad, but I'm still very excited to revisit the whole series, try and untangle the convoluted timelines and mythology, and discuss them with several different friends of the pod. So if you want to listen to that, then you just need to sign up at a $10 level. Head on over to patreon.com/evolution of horror. $10 will get you a new episode every single week and access to all of our mini seasons, including the upcoming Halloween retrospective. But you can sign up at a $5 level and get access to monthly episodes, including our Fresh Blood strand, where we discuss monthly new releases and more. Or if you want everything and you want to become a sponsor and get your own little segment in an episode, just like Martin, then you sign up at a $20 level. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. But everybody who signs up, no matter what tier they are at, will also get a very special shout shout out on the podcast as a thank you. Speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of July a very special thanks. So a big thank you to Eddie, Craig Matthews, Bonnie Cavett, Peter Falconer, Rosie French, Jennifer Gibson, Catherine Morgan, Bronte Schiltz, Craig Thompson Gold, Crystal Lake Publishing, Jake I, Henry Herbert, D. Sada, Wilbs, Jessica E, Claire Baldwin, Everything Went Black Podcast, Katie Clemens Coleman, Brandy, Scott Barber, Ryan Doyle, Isabel Onvika, Vegard Jacobson, George Nicolaides, Erin Mayer, Brittany Haig, Sarah Mayott, Jax Molitor, Caleb P. Roberts, Lauren Carnell, Joshua Klein, Richard Sard, Lindsay Loback, Carl Dunlop, Jen Rogers, Drew Mackey, and Stephen O'Sullivan. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up to our Patreon. And one more time, if you want to join them and get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's Blaxploitation special, in which Tananarive and I discuss the brilliant Ganja and Hess from 1973.
By the Christians it is written that in the Black Murphin age there existed an addiction to blood among its people. Thousands of slaves were bled to death, but murdered in such a way the slaves could not die.
Okay, Tananarive, Ganja and Hess from 1973. If you can, sum up the plot from this movie?
I mean, you almost have to put quotation marks around plot because it is not what you would call a plot-driven film.
No.
It is very meditative and stylish. You talk about style. I was talking about stylish for Interview with the Vampire. This movie is also quite stylish. And like William Crane, Bill Gunn wanted to make some statements with this film, but he wanted to go even beyond what was happening in Blacula. And instead of making it more about, like, visually, sometimes it seems like Blacula, while he is being chased by a Black investigator, he has these big fight scenes with white police officers. It has more of a tinge of the Black community sort of fending for itself against the outer world. Whereas I would say Ganja and Hess is way more about the monster within.
Yeah.
And addiction. And I would say probably this director looking at issues he thought affected the Black community and not making, there's a little bit of a reference to white supremacy in Ganja and Hess when, all right, let me set this stage. And first, let me go to the plot, because there is kind of a plot.
Yeah.
There's sort of a plot. There's this Dr. Hess Green is this highly educated, rich, I think it's a Rolls Royce he's driving or being driven in. So really, really rich, multilingual. He lives by himself in this big house. He gets a visit from a character the director himself plays, who turns out to be suicidal, spoiler. And there's this weird conversation they have sitting in a tree where there's a rope visible or something. It's just like, I don't know, it evokes kind of lynching, and they're talking about, and this is the one time he makes race explicit.
Yeah.
Dr. Hess says, I'm a Black man. What, you know, if a body turns up on my property, the police are going to be looking at me. And you could see that he did not relish this idea. And when the guy commits suicide, he also attacks his host with these knives that he has brought from, again, the continent of Africa. And and I don't understand why he does that. That's one of my questions.
I was going to ask you this question.
I have no idea. I have no idea why he attacks him. Okay. But it happens. It's a thing. It happened. And as a result of that, now Hess is a vampire and has begun his sort of quiet feeding. And he's basically a predator who you know, goes into the city every once in a while and feeds off of some underprivileged Black person. That's all we ever see.
Yeah.
And ultimately there's this weird kind of conflict between Christianity and almost sort of the made up mythology of the African religion that would have inspired his vampirism, sort of like this sort of battle royale between Western religion and African based religions, which happens. It's happened more than once in Black horror. I think it's somewhat unfortunate, but at the same time, there's that opposition. There are these beautiful images set in history of a woman walking in African regalia through an open field, and kind of a longing for ancestor, a longing for connection to the past. Mm-hmm. That's something that is common, I think, between Blacula and Ganja and Hess, but that's basically where the similarities end.
Yeah.
Because Blacula is a much more traditionally structured story.
Yeah.
Beginning, middle, end. And Ganja and Hess does have those story beats, like, okay, the visitor shows up, the visitor commits suicide, his wife shows up looking for him, he starts an affair with the wife. But the movie is more about what happens in between these beats, like the image of Black love, for example, which is hinted at in Blacula, and I would say more kind of soaking like in a bathtub in Ganja and Hess. Not literally, we see them soaking, but they're sinking into each other's eyes, sinking into each other's thoughts. She follows him into this life of vampirism. He loves her so much that he brings her with him, even though, and again, why? Because he doesn't seem to like the lifestyle that much, but he's brought her along, and she took to it like a duck to water, though, I have to say. She was way better at it. She was way better at vampiring than he is.
Yes.
and then soon after he initiates her, it's not enough. Having the love isn't enough. Having the partner that you can share your kills with isn't enough. He feels this deep sort of, it looks like existential malaise that the only cure for is Christianity. And church scenes are something else that pop up quite a bit in Black horror. There's another Blaxploitation era movie called Abby.
Yes.
Which is not nearly as good as either of these movies. In fact, it's quite silly at times. But again, the Black church, that sense of community and history that's rooted in the Black church appears in Abby. It appears in this film. And it appears in Ganja and Hess quite powerfully as kind of the antidote to his depression. And ultimately, he kind of ends up committing suicide himself, right? It's not the same kind of suicide as his visitor, but it's sort of surrendering himself to the cross. And when you do that as a vampire, that means you die.
Yeah.
Vampires cannot surrender themselves to the cross. So he chose that over vampirism. He'd only been a vampire for a couple of weeks, if that. I mean, really, it feels like he was a vampire for 2 days. He was like, I can't do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he let it go.
Whereas Ganja's like, yeah, sure, let's do this.
Yeah, Ganja's the last image of the movie. I mean, this is not, again, a plot-oriented movie, so it will sound like I'm spoiling it. But again, it's like what happens between the plot beats that I think the movie is actually about.
Absolutely.
I will argue. And she's that smile on her face as she's looking at someone she turned coming back to life, running toward her, completely buck naked, by the way, full on male nudity, very unusual and shocking for the 1970s. But that smile on her face indicates that she's good with this life.
Yeah.
She's good with this. Hess couldn't handle it. Ganja will be fine. And I guess vampirism is in the eye of the, not the beholder so much. It's like, everybody has their own personal experience with it. Some people are suited for it. Some people are not.
It's what a fascinating film, right? I watched it for the first time and I had to immediately watch it again because I thought, I really enjoyed this, but I don't have a clue what was going on.
What was going on? What is this even trying to say right now?
Right, exactly.
So,
but like you said,
yes.
it's probably not. It's not a film where the plot is necessarily the most important element, I suppose, right?
No, it's those quiet conversations. It's the artwork that fills his house, which is this strange combination of sort of European-inspired wealth, but also Afrocentrism thrown in there, kind of like, where do you fit as a wealthy Black person in society? Where does Black love fit in all of the travails in the world? It's more philosophical, I would say. And the story is, and it has this weird backstory too, because the backstory is that this director, Bill Gunn, who had been a playwright and had also done other screenplays, so he had his foot firmly in the door of Hollywood. I can almost hear the conversation where his agent was like, yeah, they want Blacula's doing good numbers. What's your Blacula? And he did not want to make a movie that was just about Black vampires. That was not interesting to him. So he tried to figure out, okay, how can I use this opportunity to make a film that would be interesting to me, talking about the things that I want to talk about. So the vampirism part is almost tangential. It's like just a part of a larger conversation about addiction and the nature of addiction and how visceral addiction, like there's one point where you see him licking blood off the floor, right? It's like this nature of addiction, like that reduces you to that almost animalistic imagery. But also love, the beautiful soft focus, moments that are shot with Ganja are also, I think, as important to this director. They look beautiful together. Once again, played by Dwayne Jones, by the way, the same guy who was the lead in Night of the Living Dead, plays Dr. Hess in Ganja and Hess.
Very few roles, right, in his career, but
I think those were the ones.
Right, exactly. But incredible. What a charismatic performer in both films, right? And actually, Hess doesn't do a hell of a lot, really, but yet he's still so charismatic. I think
No, he looks great. And he is very charismatic, and. You can. So apparently, the director Bill Gunn got his cast together. It sounds like he almost snuck off to do the movie in secret and just shoot the movie he wanted to shoot without supervision or without anyone telling him no. And I can only imagine the reaction when he turned it in. It was probably the opposite of Blacula, which seemed to be celebrated and do really well. This movie, they didn't get it. They recut it into a movie called Blood Couple, which I haven't seen, but I can only imagine is terrible. And then the Cannes Film Festival, it did amazing. It was celebrated, but literally it was put in movie jail. And I call it movie jail because for years and years and years, even if you were a film connoisseur and you were lucky enough that you had even heard of Ganja and Hess, the only way to watch it was to go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York and rent it individually, for a single viewing.
Wow.
What kind of way is that to treat a movie? In horror noir, the director Ernest Dickerson, who's a great horror director, says that the only way he saw Bill Gunn come to Howard University when he was a student, but he could only talk about the movie. He didn't even have a copy of it himself.
Wow.
So it's a tragic backstory for a movie like Ganja and Hess, which has now been unearthed and everybody considers it like this beautiful cult classic. But during the director's lifetime, not so much.
And why do you think, like you said, Cannes Film Festival loved it, right? Why do you think America didn't embrace it? Was it too weird, too art house? Was there a racism element to why audiences didn't embrace it? What do you think?
Too weird, too art house. Too Black would be the way I would describe it. Yeah. There was just not enough of an infrastructure, not enough executives among distributors or studios to recognize the beauty of this piece.
Yeah.
Instead, they were just, some people might have been threatened by it. Most people were probably just dismissive of it and said, I don't get this. It's not for me.
And we were talking about this in the context of Blaxploitation, but is this even Blaxploitation? It doesn't feel like it ticks those same boxes that those other movies you've mentioned do,
No, I mean, not at all. There's no pimp in it at all. There's no pimp hats, pimp clothing.
Yeah.
It's it does not have the costumes of the Blaxploitation era. I think it just happened to have been made in the 70s because his orders were to do something like Blacula. But no, it's not a Blaxploitation film in the same sense at all.
It's really clever. It's like a kind of Trojan horse, right? Where it probably got greenlit, like you said, because studio said, go and make another Blacula, go and make another black vampire movie that can be as successful as Blacula. And then Bill Gunn used that as a vehicle to then actually tell the story he wanted to tell, right? Which was something that was much more weird, much more profound, much more reflective and introspective, and seems to be tackling so many themes, right? I mean, like, what is this film to you really about? Because it seems to be, on the one hand, about race. It definitely seems to be exploring ideas of class, I think.
There are conflicting statements. I mean, you want to say on the one hand, it's a statement about class, but then you have this rich black character literally feeding on the poor.
Yeah.
Is that the statement? But we're supposed to be empathizing with that character. So whose story is it? Who are we empathizing with? Even the conflict between African mythologies and Western religion, Christianity, that feels a bit conflicted to me. On the one hand, celebratory, but on the other hand, oppositional. Right. So there's a lot of inner conflicts within Ganja and Hess that I think the filmmaker is also working out.
Yeah, there is even conflict in the filmmaking itself as well, because I feel like so much of it is dreamlike and stylized, and then at other times it almost looks documentary-like, you know, like when we've got that long
scene when he goes into town.
Yeah, in town.
And the church.
In the church, you know, it feels like we're just looking in at real life there as well, doesn't it? So even that, it's like we don't quite know what movie we're supposed to be watching at times.
Right, you're kind of walking between reality and a dream. I think that's very well put, is what it seems like. And that church scene is super long. It's like actually going to the service. It's like, wow, how long have we been here? Yeah.
I know, right? I know. Suddenly you forget what movie you're watching at that point, I think.
And then the less interesting conflict is, despite what I just said about the last shot of Ganja smiling as she watches this full frontal male character running toward her. Then we cut away to the credits and it's children singing this uplifting song from church. Yeah. What? What is he saying there? I don't know.
I know. Do you teach this movie as well? Because I was wondering, what do students make of this movie?
Even with all the questions I have, of course, I still teach it. And they roll with it. You know, they roll with it. It's a fascinating piece of film for study because there is so much. It's so rich and it's so singular. I mean, there are things that to this day you haven't seen recreated in terms of a character who's like that, with that much money, who lives that isolated lifestyle with a driver, and who, you know, I'm trying to think, who would that be? Even in contemporary filmmaking, that it's still so unique and so interesting, and my students enjoy talking about it.
It's so rich. Where do we even start? I wanna sort of go through it in sort of act by act, I suppose, briefly, because it does feel like the movie is in sort of 2 or 3 chunks. And that first chunk, as you described, is really strange. This is before Ganja even comes into the film, and it's all to do with Hess and this visitor he has, played by Bill Gunn himself, right? And this weird dynamic that they have this very strange, uncomfortable conversation where the visitor is trying to make kind of jokes. He's telling that story about the confusion between the word cut and cunt in Holland.
Anyway, I was saying about this friend of mine who was directing a picture in Holland, and the thing that you've got to know about this story is that in Dutch, cut means cunt. Thank you very much. Very sweet of you. He was directing this scene, and there were a lot of people in the street. And suddenly he yells, cunt, cut. And all these people get very upset at him. And they start throwing things at him. I mean, they're throwing everything at him because he did a dirty word, you know. Anyway, the interpreter comes downstairs, right? And he tells them that you can't say cut in Holland, because if you do, you're getting a lot of trouble. So anyway, we get the scene on, we go back to the end of the scene, and the guy yells, cut. Dig it? You understand what I mean? I mean, it's a very fantastic thing. I thought that was terrific.
It's like you say. It's the importance, I guess, of the moments between the big plot points and these kinds of conversations. But I don't really understand what we're supposed to get from this conversation. Maybe just this idea of kind of social awkwardness and miscommunication and cultural differences, right, and clashes. And we're kind of seeing that as this conversation plays out, because this movie, as you said, this kind of, again, showed black characters that we hadn't really seen before, particularly in Blaxploitation movies. Hess is very rich. He has a butler. He is very educated, very erudite. And he is very unimpressed by this story, right? So straight away, you think there is some weird tension between these two characters, between Hess and his visitor. Then we have that whole sequence, like you said, where the visitor tries to commit suicide. Hess stops him because he says, I'm going to get in trouble with the police if you do. That's another very strange interaction. This visitor man is clearly unhinged. He's clearly mentally ill. And he flips then from suicide to homicide, right? And he then attacks and stabs Hess with this knife, which ultimately is what turns him into a vampire, right? Before he eventually then ends up killing himself in the bath. And it's like, what is... what is happening? Like, what... I don't... it's fascinating, all this stuff that we're seeing, but it's very strange. What do you think's happening here?
It is. Well, you've just described it. It is very strange. What I find most offensive, and a bridge too far for me with that character he plays, is that he brushes his teeth with his bathwater.
Whoa, that was too much.
That's like the scariest scene in the whole movie to me. I've never seen that before. So whatever comes out of his mouth, you sort of have to take in the context of this is a guy who will brush his teeth with his bathwater. So, of course, he's going to sound a little off when he's talking about murder and suicide and any of the stories he tells. He's just this, I don't know. He strikes me as like one of those people who would be a super, super interesting dinner guest.
Yes.
But as Dr. Hess learned, you do not want to let him overstay his welcome.
No.
Or he might never leave.
Right.
Literally might never leave.
And Dr. Hess is not impressed with him from the beginning, it feels like.
No,
right?
He's really not.
He's really not.
It could just be, given that the director-writer plays that role, you can't help but look for the significance of the interplay between the artist and his character, right? Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it could have been just sort of two sides of this filmmaker's personality.
Yeah.
The sort of flighty, reckless, slightly suicidal part of an artist, and the more stoic, accomplished, and even keeled character he created, although at the end he was not that even keeled. The vampirism brought out more of his reckless nature and his suicidal nature. So, with a lot of art, different characters are just different versions of the filmmaker or the writer. So I would say that you could look at Dr. Hess and Bill Gunn's character as basically different versions of that artist.
That's really interesting. And there is this constant sort of exploration of suicide and murder and the way that the two relate to each other, right? The visitor even has a kind of monologue where he talks about that, the two different sides of him and what that means if he kills himself, whether it makes him, suicidal or whether it makes him a murderer. And obviously he tries to kill himself and then he commits murder, or he tries to. Later on, as you've already mentioned, Hess kills himself as well, essentially. Like, he sacrifices himself to the cross, ending his vampire life. So again, there's something really interesting going on there, isn't there? That both of them commit murder and then both of them commit suicide. And they are the two male characters, whereas the female character of Ganja doesn't commit suicide. She's kind of left, like we said, sort of happily ever after at the end, potentially. So there are a lot of kind of interesting themes at play, I think, in looking at the dynamics between these three. Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit about the way the vampirism is portrayed, because Hess is turned into a vampire by this dagger, right? And we're sort of given a backstory at the beginning through that beautiful song, that music that is that's composed by Sam Wayman, that opening song that basically kind of lays out the mythology of the vampires in this.
Thousands of slaves were bled to death, but murdered in such a way the slaves could not die.
This idea that thousands of years ago, there was this curse, thousands of slaves were bled to death, but they were murdered in such a way that they couldn't die. And they were sort of forced to walk forever addicted to blood, right? And so there is this, vampirism is kind of treated as a curse in this. And, I guess the kind of vampirism that we see happen on screen, it doesn't really feel like, for example, compared to Blacula, it's not like your typical monster wearing a cape with fangs biting into somebody and making them a vampire, right? No.
Very stylized, even like his most, I would say, unforgivable kill, which I think was with a sex worker, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's kind of gauzy, the way it's shot.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of almost like posing over the body. And that's more the point than the attack. Because in a lot of vampire movies, it's the attack that it's like going in for the neck. That is the point. But this one, it was more just the fact that it had happened seemed to be the point. Oh, this is what he's done now. And it's shot in such a way that makes you feel like you're supposed to reflect upon it.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're supposed to reflect upon the meaning of it. And, the only meaning I draw from that is the juxtaposition between this very, very rich man and this woman who, as a sex worker, you would imagine was sort of living in desperation, and how he's literally feeding on her.
Mm-hmm.
So is that a statement about the newly emerging Black middle and upper classes in the 1970s and their relationship to the community they're leaving behind at the end of segregation? I mean, I may be reading too much into that, but I would be surprised if, given how rich he was, that isn't part of the point.
Absolutely. And I do think it's interesting as well, even the way that some characters are shot, like often his kind of butler character or, is stood there with his head cut out of shot and things like that as well. He's almost like this kind of, like all of that kind of thing where like it almost sort of anonymous or something in the background, that whole scene where Ganja is talking to him and she says, I want the grapes, the grape jelly and all of this. And he stood there the entire time with his head out of shot as well. So I think like you can't help but think that all of these decisions are probably deliberate in some way or another, right?
Oh yeah. Ganja was terrible to his butler. Well, first, the fact that a Black man has a butler is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah.
But she was as terrible to that butler as any stereotypically white character would be terrible to any other Black butler. Yeah. And that was very interesting.
Well, Ganja's such an interesting character, isn't she? I think, again, the film kind of enters another new sort of realm when she enters the picture. And again, like you said earlier, her motivations are a bit murky. She doesn't seem to be that fussed that her husband has been killed and his body is in the freezer. And she starts off this relationship with Hess and they both turn into vampires. But she seems to kind of embrace that vampirism more than him. But I think all of it is rooted in the story she tells from when she's young, right? And the fact that she had an innocent snowball fight with some boys and her mother called her a slut and her mother never really loved her. And ever since then, she's kind of done whatever she can to get by, and she does whatever is the best for Ganja, right? And she talks about that quite overtly, which I guess kind of explains a lot of her actions throughout that second half of the film and why she just kind of rolls with the punches.
And my mother said, "Where have you been?" And I said, "I've been having this tremendous snowball fight. It's really fun. And I beat everybody, and everybody beat me. It was a tremendous day." And she slapped my face and said, "Where have you been?" Someone said they saw you being chased by a boy. I said, "We were all chasing each other because we were having a snowball fight." And she said, "You are a liar and a slut." It was as though I was a disease. I have a brother that's 10 years older than I am. I have a sister that's 8 years older than I am. So that I was obviously an accident. And it was Ganja. I came down with Ganja, And I think that day I decided that I was a disease. And I was going to give her a full case of it. That whatever it was I was, she was going to have it. But that was a very decisive day in my life. Because that day I decided that I would provide for Ganja, always. Do whatever had to be done. Take whatever steps had to be taken. But always take care of Ganja.
What do you make of the character of Ganja and that performance by Marlene Clark?
She's a very strange character.
Yeah, she's great, isn't she?
She's charismatic. She's beautiful, actually. And she kind of just rolls with things, like she rolls with her husband's disappearance. She rolls with being a vampire. I don't know what kind of statement that is, to be honest. Maybe he just liked the way the camera held her, or just this fascinating woman who is going to survive no matter what. That could be part of what maybe she had reminded him of some women he had known in his life. I'm not really sure.
It's such an interesting film, and I love those moments as well when it feels like when something scary or something vampiric is about to happen, where you get that kind of African sort of music start to sort of slowly feed in at those moments. It really gives it a kind of eerie vibe, I think, at that moment, and dreamlike again,
It is. It's eerie and it's dreamlike, but it also, I think, speaks to that almost, I would say, discomfort with finding a way to have that Africanness coexist in Western culture, because so often it's portrayed as other, even in this movie, right? It's like the sort of the mysterious, frightening other.
Yeah, especially with the way that it slowly becomes kind of distorted and more horrific as it goes on as well. So this movie, like you said, it didn't really find an audience instantly. It sort of has over time. Do you think, we talked about the kind of the impact and legacy of Blacula. What kind of an impact do you think Ganja and Hess has had? I mean, do you think that now in 2022, a lot of filmmakers are kind of discovering and are being influenced by movies like Ganja and Hess?
That remains to be seen. It has not been that long that Ganja and Hess has even been available to wider audiences, even in just the past 5 years, I think. Even when Horror Noir came out in 2019, I'm not sure you could just find Ganja and Hess anywhere. I think Shudder had it for a while. I'm not sure where it is now, but one of the great things about this era and streaming is that so many lost films are being resurrected so that they can find their audience at last. And if nothing else, I guess Ganja and Hess is a lesson to filmmakers that, like a Jordan Peele, even though you do have those commercial considerations and you have big executives and studios behind them sometimes wanting you to perform a certain way, that you can still insert your own voice and your own passions in this work. And in fact, if you don't instill your own voice and your own passion in the work, it's much less likely that it will succeed with the kind of big numbers that the producers are looking for in the first place.
Yeah, and that leads us perfectly onto our final question then, because, Ganja and Hess it's one of those movies that's so rich we could probably talk about it for another 2 hours, but there's no time, unfortunately. So I want to finish, Tananarive, by just asking you about, I guess, the legacy of what these two left and what happened to black horror after this Blaxploitation movement. You mentioned already that in the 1980s things took a bit of a kind of step backwards, right? The characters, there's a really interesting section on this in Horror Noir, isn't there? But the way that maybe there was slightly more black representation in mainstream horror, but they were again relegated to supporting roles, to the friend or to the character that died first in the slasher movie or whatever.
It was like the long desert. The 80s were not very hopeful. And then moving into the 90s, there was a big, big difference. There was a real big African-American art renaissance in the States during the 90s. In literature, that's when I started publishing. And I feel like I got a much better opportunity to publish because it was the timing. It was like every black art was just like they said in Get Out, black is in. Black art was in. So then you had Death by Temptation by an artist named James Bond III, and that led the way to everything from Eve's Bayou to Tales from the Hood, with Rusty Cundiff directing that one. Even Candyman, which I don't consider Black horror because it's through a white lens. It's sort of Black monstrosity through a white lens, more so than horror designed for a Black audience. But even that is partially driven by the era when audiences were accepting more Black faces, more Black characters. And again, it died out again. I mean, it's like, so the 70s up, the 80s down, 90s up. And then the decade after that, kind of, you had your same stock characters who were friends and sidekicks. But it wasn't until really Get Out, I would say, in 2017.
Yeah.
That we start to get back to a period that's more like the 70s, that's more like the 90s. And the big difference, I think, is that this one will have more staying power for two reasons. A, there are so many more platforms and people are so hungry for work that I don't think it would be possible for it to die out almost completely as it did in the 80s. And secondly, it's never been cheaper to make it yourself. A simple iPhone is I mean, it would take some training and sometimes some special equipment, but you literally can make a feature film on an iPhone. And that's never been true before.
Yeah.
So that's also a game changer for people who have the creativity and the vision to do that. You can throw it up on YouTube. You can sell it directly to Amazon. There are things that were not possible. So while it is the nature of the business to kind of snap back to the comfort zone, like hiring your friends to write scripts, or greenlighting stories that more directly reflect your own experience, we're starting to get more people of color within those decision-making positions. But even when it wants to snap back, the audience has demonstrated such a hunger for these films. And I've just seen Nope, and I think Nope is going to be a huge hit. I don't think that the door can close again. I don't think the door can close again like it has in the past, even though it might try to.
And I've got to ask you, no spoilers, but you liked Nope, did you? You were a fan?
I loved Nope. I was a little worried because I could tell from the trailers that it was more of a big budget kind of traditional. It looked like more of a big budget traditional Hollywood thriller, which is fantastic. But I don't know how long Jordan Peele worked on it. I don't know what kind of pressures he's dealing with, and was his vision going to be compromised? And I am happy to say it absolutely was not compromised. And yes, it is that bigger budget popcorn thriller at times, but it definitely still has that Jordan Peele core that is absolutely subversive. If you're willing to notice it.
So excited. Well, Tananarive, thank you so much for joining me. My final question to you, which I like to ask all my guests at the end, is What is your favorite ever horror movie?
Oh, come on. That's not a fair. I more and more, I'm just going to be comfortable. Sometimes you want to go back to childhood or the formative period. There are a lot of movies I could mention that are just, I watch over and over again. Like, okay, God dang it. Like Nightmare on Elm Street and Alien.
Yeah.
And, but really, I think my favorite is Get Out.
Yeah.
Just because of the societal impact it has had and continues to have. And on me personally, on my work personally, there will never be another Get Out, or need to be, hopefully, in terms of what it had to do in terms of breaking down barriers. But it is absolutely a tight, singular piece of work, and it's still going to be my favorite for probably a long time.
It's perfect, isn't it? Just absolutely perfect. Tananarive, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to this week's brilliant guest, Tananarive Due. What an honour to have her on the podcast this week, discussing these two brilliant, rich films. There was probably so much more to discuss, but we ran out of time. But I would love to hear from you guys. What do you think of these two movies, and what are your thoughts on them? How do you interpret Ganja and Hess? I'd love to hear from you. Please do drop me an email, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. or you can find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. If you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow horror fans and fellow listeners, there are two places you can go. You can join our Discord, the Evolution of Horror Discord, or you can join the discussion group. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which you can find on Facebook. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as this really helps us get discovered by new listeners. Okay, on to next week then, and we've nearly reached the end of the 1970s, but there's one more key text to discuss, which I'm very excited about. Next week, we're talking one film and one film only, but it's a beast of a film. In fact, it's not really a film, it's a 3-hour television event. Next week, I'm going to be joined by Louise Blaine and Stevie Webb, and the three of us are going to be deep diving into the world of Salem's Lot. Yes, we'll be talking about Tobe Hooper's adaptation of Stephen King's novel from 1979. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.